Ahoy! This is the second part of the How to Build Your Character video series. In this video, I'm going to talk about equipment and stats, which item you need, what you should aim for in its craft option and slots, and what your goal should be with each of the important stats. First of all, let's talk about critical rate. The higher the better basically. Initially, you should aim to get 50%, but later on the ideal for dungeon farming in parties is probably 69%. Why 69? Well, Warrior's debuff called Panic Cry and Force Blader's debuff called Hard Luck give the target a total of minus 31% critical rate resistance, which basically means your critical rate is increased by 31%, which makes it 100 if we ignore the base resistances for now. If your character is going to be participating in PvP often, then it might be worth going over 70%. Your base critical rate is 5%, and the rings are the most basic source of that. But even with the optimal rings, you've got 37% rate only. That means you're going to need at least 20-25% from other sources. Some classes like Force Shielder and Force Blader have it easier, since they can achieve 60% critical rate without any serious effort, whereas a wizard, for example, will need critical rate from almost every source possible. I will talk about those sources soon. As for the other stats, for any dungeon below Tower of the Dead B3F, I think around 6000 attack rate and 800 accuracy is enough, but as with everything else, it won't hurt to have more. Attack M, critical damage and penetration should be as high as possible. They basically define your damage, so you just can't have enough of them. The same goes for defense, defense rate, evasion and damage reduction too. Just try to get as much as possible of them without sacrificing too much of your damage. Now, health steal is a very important stat to talk about. Once again, link in the video description of an explanation of how it works. Initially, you're going to need like 5% or more while damage is still low under level 150, which you can get from a ring or gloves, for example. But once you learn the rune and max it, I don't think it will be necessary to get any more health steal from other sources. Health steal limit is something you should also get from rune and wear a pair of vampiric earrings to increase it further. This is probably your best friend when it comes to surviving in dungeons or fields. Many people seem to believe that defense or evasion from earrings is better, and in some situations they may be right, but personally, I think health steal is the best thing you can get to stay alive. Of course, in wars and other PvP activities, you should have a pair of earrings with defense to replace them temporarily. Now let's move on to the items. First thing to consider is that the critical rate you can get from rings is limited to 32%, or at level 200 it's 33%. So if you've got a special ring like Killian or Tempius, there's space only for one more ring with 15 or 17% critical rate. The other two should give you damage instead, ideally Tyrant's ring for one and a critical ring for the other one. There is an alternative to use Ring of Fighter or Sage plus 10 because it also gives 10% critical damage and some attack, defense and attack rate. However, I, as well as pretty much every top player I've seen on my server, believe that critical ring plus 2 or higher is better for damage later on. Let's move on to the Amulet. Amulet is one of the main sources of maximum critical rate. Luckily, the amulets from Awakened Hazardous Valley nowadays are available to just about everyone. Now, in my opinion, 1 or 2 more % of max crit rate is far more important than more amp or critical damage from the epic options. That is, of course, if you can fill it with rate. Amulet of Pain plus 6 or plus 7 may serve as good alternatives until you can farm an Orphideus amulet for yourself. And for PvP, an Amulet of Resist is a very good idea to keep in your inventory. Your weapons and helmet are the best sources of critical damage, and if you're a class that needs it, critical rate too. For example, when I was a wizard, I needed 7% rate from both weapons and helmet to achieve high enough critical rate. But a Force Blader might need to consider going full damage and putting amp in the third slot when making endgame items. The craft option of your weapon and helmet should be critical damage in almost all cases. However, a budget option that also works very well for a long time is to get a helm with 8 or more % critical rate as craft option and fill one of the slots with rate and the other two with damage. That temporarily lets you save some money on weapons without rate, or allows you to reach very high rate, possibly over 70%. The rest of the armor parts should have all skill amp up as craft option at least one slot. Whether the slot is empty or not, it gives your item more defense, so it's always useful. Now let's see what to fill those slots with. Suit and gloves are the only armor pieces that can give you maximum critical rate. Now initially you might want to fill one slot of your gloves with health steals to help you stay alive, but later on that will be kinda useless. Most endgame builds have 3% max rate in both gloves and suit. Initially you can also fill the slots of your suit with HP as it may help you survive. Another thing to note here is that many developing players tend to aim for gloves or suit with amp craft and 7% amp in slot instead of maximum critical rate. But think about it. Do you want to deal 100 more damage with your hit or have 2 more % chance to deal triple damage? It's your call, but I don't think sacrificing critical rate is worth it for amp as long as you can have max rate in one slot. As for your shoes, before you can afford amp scroll, HP and HP steal limit are both good options to fill them with. I personally prefer HP steal limit as I mentioned at the earrings. I used to have plus 20 of that in the shoes of my wizard and that helped me survive in lots of places. But later on, since the only thing in the slots of boots that can increase your damage is amp, you should fill all its slots with it. The thing about amp is that it suffers no penalty for being in multiple slots of the same item. For example, if you try to fill 3 slots with critical damage or rate in a helmet, the last slot gives only 1%. Similarly, for maximum critical rate, the first slot gives 3% if extended, and the other two only 2% each. So it's not really worth doing that. However, amp gives 8% in all 3 slots, so basically, if any of your items serves its purpose and has an empty slot, fill them with amp for your amp game set. Bracelets, Sage and Fighter versions are very good for a start because they give you a bunch of skill amp, and at lower levels attack rate can be very useful to get rid of those annoying blocks. But as you progress your character, you're going to need more maximum critical rate, and Sienna's bracelets are ideal for 2 more % of that. So getting a pair of those is usually a good idea, even if their additional benefits are worse. However, later on you're going to realize how awesome penetration is, and those bracelets are a really good source of that. So I think once you get your full set with 7 or more amp and weapons over plus 15, you can start focusing on penetration in your bracelets. You may find that even with pretty bad options, the plus 50 penetration is often the best choice, but still try not to buy the worst one out there just for that. Let's talk about vehicles. I see a lot of new players buying an Astral bike after weeks of farming for it only for the defense. I think that's a terrible idea. Chances are you won't even notice plus 50 defense or so. The Astral board from the miniboss in Portlax is good enough until you can afford a blue bike with something that actually helps you. Fortunately, nowadays blue bikes with attacking slots are actually quite cheap, but vehicles can also grant you critical rates, so if you want that, you should think about a K-Red board first of all. It's in the item shop for something like 7 vouchers. Well, I know that's actually really expensive, but it still might be cheaper than a bike with 5% rate. Belts, arcanas, cornelians, talismans and epaulets don't really need any explanation, I suppose. Just try to get the highest you can afford. Belt might have a priority over the rest because it increases your damage the most probably. Charm is the only item that can increase the duration of your battle modes. That is something that can be extremely useful. However, if you want to buy a charm just for that, you may want to save up some more money and get one with a stat that's actually useful. For example, Aimber gives damage reduction, which I believe is the best option for regular players. The duration increase starts at plus 5 by the way, so I don't think you should get anything below that. Just a quick thought about effectors. For the offensive ones, your best bet is probably penetration. If you're a Force Blader, you should aim for an Art of Curse effector with 90% defense. That is the most important thing about that effector. Don't bother with the other two stats if you can't afford a perfect one, just make sure the defense component is as high as possible. Now for the pet, your trustworthy companion. This is probably something random for new players because you can't control the outcome of pet training. So basically you should just keep trying until you get something that you consider useful. However, a hint, the best two things you can aim at in the normal slots are maximum critical rate and critical rate. Max rate is probably the best because you can get a total of 10% from one pet, which would let you replace max rate in your suit or gloves with amp, for example. Costume is the last thing to consider, I believe. It's similar to pets, so critical rate related things might be the best. 6% rate can be achieved if you fill all 3 slots with it, which is quite a lot. I suppose it's best if you get your max rate from pet and your rate from costume. However, if you're a regular player, filling a costume slots with attack or magic attack will give you plus 60 of it, which is pretty good for a start if you can't afford anything better. Attack scrolls for costumes are practically free after all. Costumes can also have penetration in their slots, which is a good idea if you don't need rate from them. Putting the same thing in custom slots doesn't have diminishing returns like regular items, by the way. Well, that's about it for today, but rest assured there is a third part coming soon, hopefully. I'll try to finish and upload it as soon as possible. If you found this video helpful, please consider sharing it or subscribing to my channel. Ahoy!